In this tutorial I will show you how to do grid-like movement, and by the end of the video we'll implement as well a shooting functionality. Let's start. Hello guys, my name is Marius, and as I mentioned in the first video, we want to give back to the community what we learned in our projects. So today I will show you a quick tutorial on how to do a grid-like movement in 3D with Unity. As a bonus, through the end of this video I will show you how to implement shooting with bullets from the direction that the player is facing. So let's jump in. I opened here an empty 3D project with nothing on the scene, and on the assets folder in our project window we'll just create a new folder. We'll call this script. We want to stay as organized as possible. In the scripts folder we'll create a new C# script. We'll name it player controller or anything you like, but this script will be attached on our player, so I named it player controller. Okay, now we will just open up our script with Visual Studio, and as you can see here we have our player controller script. In our player controller we'll declare a public float variable. We'll name it speed, and for now we'll just initialize it with 2. And now in our update function we'll initialize a float variable named horizontal input, and we want to get the axis horizontal. We also need a float variable for our vertical axis, and I will explain to you in details in a moment. And we'll just need here the vertical axis. So we initialize here the variables with the input axis. For horizontal we called the horizontal axis, which is predefined in the Unity input system, the old system. If you have the new system this will not work. As well as for the vertical axis we just store the variable, and this will get our input from the player if it presses W or S and A or D for the horizontal movement, as well as the arrow keys. And now we'll want to see actually what happens when we get the input from our player, and we'll just make in this update function vector 3. We will call this move direction, which will store the direction that the player is moving on our horizontal axis, and we will initialize it with a new vector 3, and here we'll just put our horizontal input. If you can see here in our vector 3 we have two float variables for the x values and the y values. Those values represent the axis in the game. So we'll just store the horizontal input for the x-axis for the y-axis it will be 0 because we don't want to have movement on the y-axis, and 0 as well for the z-axis because we want to get input only from the horizontal axis, which represents the x value. And we will do the same for our vertical input. We'll start a vector 3, move direction 2, and we will initialize it with a new vector 3. And here we will want to store the input when our player moves on the vertical plane. So we'll have 0 on the y, on the x, 0 on the y, and we will store the vertical input on the z-axis with vertical input. So now we will want to translate our movement with if move direction does not equal vector 3 dot 0 and here we'll just use transform that translate move direction multiplied by speed multiplied by time at delta time in reference to the space world. So what happens here? If we get input from our player from the horizontal input and the vector 3 does not equal 0, that means that here we have input and this value is not equal 0, then translate this movement multiplied by speed, which we set a variable in the beginning of our code, and multiplied by time, delta time, because we want to be time related and frame independent, and relative to the space world, which is based on the axis of the world. And we want to now to get the motion from our vertical input as well, so we'll just make here an else if statement with move direction to not equal vector 3.0 and we'll just use the same line of code from the first statement, and we'll just replace it with move direction to. And what happens here exactly, if the player is moving on the horizontal input, it will move only on the horizontal input, and if the player is not moving on the horizontal input and gets input from our vertical axis, it will move on the vertical. We will create here a 3D object. Let's make it a plane to have ground which our player will move on, and as for the player, we'll create here also a 3D object cube. We'll just move it up a bit to make sure it's on the ground. This is the y-axis, x-axis and z-axis. So we want our player to move only on the x-axis and the z-axis. name this cube player. We will create some material for the player just to see some colors and not the default one. Name it player material, and let's just give it a color. Let's make it a bright orange one. And now let's attach our script. If we play this, as you can see now, our player should move. Let's move the camera up a bit and maybe rotate it. Let's just move it up more, and now we'll rotate it a bit down. Let's see now, as we can see better, how the object will move in the scene. The player can move only based on a grid-like movement. I mentioned earlier in the video that we will also implement shooting with bullets mechanic. 3D object on our player, and we will make it a cube, and now let's just move it up a bit, and we will scale it a bit down more, 0.2, 0.2, okay, and we will just move in this cube and a bit in front. Create a new material, then direction material, just to see the point in which direction the player is looking, and we'll just make it green. And now let's move the camera more in the scene just to see exactly what will happen. So now in the game view we should see clearly in which direction the player is facing. But now if we play with our script as it is, we will see one problem. The player moves grid-like, but it's not actually turning. So to solve this issue, we'll just go back on our script, and we'll just add here transform dot forward equals move direction. And same for our move direction too. If we just save and go back in our Unity project, if we hit play, we will see that actually the player is now turning in the direction that it's moving. We will create on our player an empty object, and we will name this fire bullet, and you will see in a minute why we do this for our script. And in our scene now we have to make sure that our fire bullet object, empty object, it's placed just ahead of this turret. We will instantiate the bullet from this empty game object, and we will create here a public float. We'll name it fire time, and we will give it a value of 3 by default, and we can tweak them if we need them. Create another float variable. We'll name it public float bullet speed, and we'll give it a default value of 3 as well. A public game object, and we will name it bullet prefab, because we will need to store the prefab of the bullet to instantiate it. A public transform, and we will name it fire bullet, because we will need a reference of the empty object where we will instantiate the bullet. And now below the update function, we will create a private void fire function, and in here we will just create a variable of type game object. We'll name it bullet, and we will equal it with instantiate bullet prefab at the transform position of our fire bullet, because that's where we want to fire position, as well as fire bullet rotation. And now we will just write bullet that transform that position equals fire bullet transform that position. And now we will write here bullet that get component, because we need to get a reference from a rigid body, and I will explain in the moment why we need the rigid body. Because we use now a function named add force, and we will add force from our fire bullet forward direction multiplied by bullet speed, and we will use a force mode that impulse. But we will need something else. We will need in update function to get an input from our player. So we will create here an if statement input that get key down key code not space. We'll just assign this to the space key, and in our if statement we will just fire. We save now our script. We will need to create a prefab for our bullet that we can store on our script. So we will create a 3D object. Let's make it a cube. We will just scale this down to maybe, let's see, 0.1, 0.1. Okay, and this will be our bullet. We'll just create a material for it too. In our material folder, we'll create new material, bullet material. We'll give it, let's choose a color that stands out like red, and we will attach this material to our bullet. Let's rename this object as bullet. And we also want to add to our bullet a rigid body, as I told you. And we will just uncheck gravity because we don't need gravity on the bullet. Otherwise, when our player will shoot the bullet will just fall through the ground. And now we will just store this bullet as a prefab in our assets folder by dragging it down. And now if we go on our player object under our script, you can see here that we can tweak those values for our speed, our fire time, our bullet speed. I will explain in a moment for what we will use the fire time as well. And below we have a bullet prefab and the fire bullet transform. So in our bullet prefab we will just put our bullet, and in our fire bullet we'll just use our fire bullet empty object from the player, because from this position we'll instantiate the bullet. And now if we hit play, we can see that if we press the spacebar, our player will shoot a bullet from the turret. I hope you will find our tutorial useful on one of your projects. If you like our channel, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts down below. Ciao guys!